Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me for this session on pragmatic protection from insider threats. Always a pleasure for me to speak to a Data Connectors audience because I know you all take information security very seriously. My perspective on this topic today stems from a data-centric approach to information management. Over the next few minutes, I'll describe what I mean by that, and I hope provide some ideas about how a data-centric approach might benefit your organization. We'll also talk about the way some other projects that I've worked on have implemented data-centric information protection for some of my Fortune 100 clients. My name is Rick Wilson. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Solutions for Sherpa Software, and I'm recording today from just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Some of you watching today may not be familiar with Sherpa. Our focus has been creating software to help our clients manage electronic information. And we've been successfully delivering products that fulfill that mandate for a long time now. In fact, we just celebrated our 20-year anniversary. A lot has changed since we launched Mail Attender, our first product, back in 1999. We're certainly managing more information in more locations than we had 20 years ago. But it's still important to have tools in place to help you locate information and control it. Sherpa helps clients, both large and small, over a wide range of industries, address their difficult information management challenges. So let's get started. Is understanding the dangers and opportunities hiding inside organizational data and how your employees are handling that data important? Well, most of the answers to that question involve controlling risk, especially financial risk. If your goal is to reduce the organization's risk profile, which I'm certain many of you would agree with, and therefore reduce the potential economic impact of a data breach, it makes sense to focus your efforts on areas where you have the most exposure. We've termed this exposure data insecurity. And several studies, including the one referenced on this slide from Verizon, point to insiders as a significant source of data insecurity related breach events. And those events fall into three broad categories. The first category I'd label probably poor training. Today, with more people than ever working from home, it's important for them to understand how they should be handling information and where they should be storing it. That could be as simple as where the content's going to be placed on their local hard drive, or maybe it should be resident in a cloud repository like OneDrive, Box, or Dropbox. Perhaps they should be going through the corporate VPN to store it on a network file share. They need to understand those rules. And before they start saving information into those locations, they need to have some regard for the content itself. For example, is there PII inside this document? Does it contain confidential client information? If so, maybe those files should be stored in some kind of a monitored location. I believe this area in particular is one where there's a lot of room for improvement right now, since almost all of us were rushed into a remote work situation. Employees aren't often sure what rules should apply now, to be honest. When everyone was in the office, it was much easier to control access to specific network shares where content could be stored and more effectively monitored. Now, in many cases, companies don't even have tools to let them adequately monitor what's being stored on their dispersed employee devices. The second category I deem malicious intent. This one I think is much harder to defend against. The reason is if your employees are actively trying to conceal or steal information, they'll invest a tremendous amount of effort in trying to circumvent whatever controls you put in place. Ironically, many organizations are better prepared to handle this malicious intent scenario because it's something they were preparing for even before the pandemic struck by implementing group policy controls, monitoring software, and other types of protocols. And then the final data insecurity category is just flat out accidents. These certainly happen to all of us. I know I've been in a rush to send an email to a client, and I've selected the wrong address from a recipient list in that helpful little buffer that Outlook provides for me. I've also forgot to attach files that I referenced in the email document. So these types of accidental breaches, if you will, or accidental leaks of content are largely unavoidable, but they're really a minority of the incidents that we see. As an interesting sidebar to this particular topic of data insecurity, I recently was involved in a two-part series debating zero trust versus a trust but verify approach to managing information. And one of the interesting points that came out during the course of those discussions was information's really become a commodity today. And like many commodities, employees tend to no longer treat it as a valuable resource. They expect to have access to it. In some cases, they demand to have access to it. In my view, that's why it's so important to make sure they're handling that information properly by applying some kind of a verification tier to your process. So, with that in mind, I'd like to launch a little trivia question and have you start to think about information inside your organizations. How much of it, in terms of a percentage, is both readily available and important to your business? And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think that over. You know, as people answer this question, they typically tend to go with the middle tier because 35% sounds like a reasonable number. But actually, the answer is far lower. 16% is the real number here. That number was surfaced, if you'll pardon the pun, by this Veritas report. Even though this study in particular was conducted a few years ago, I think the concept of a Databerg is a tremendous visual representation of the amount of information we're dealing with in our organizations. And notice the amount of that falls into that notorious dark data area, the redundant, outdated, trivial information. You know, if we examine this segment, over half of the content is in that category, and we may not even know it's there. I run into this all the time. You know, my clients will do a scan of the network and they'll discover files on network shares that were placed there by employees who might not have worked for the company for 7, 8, 10 years. They left those files behind, they moved on, but that content is still sitting out there. It's potentially discoverable in the case of a litigation. It's probably got company secrets in it or maybe client confidential information, but it's never been disposed of because nobody was aware that it was there. The fact that we're talking about dark data doesn't mean it's unreachable. Oftentimes people confuse that dark data with being unreachable, and that's not it at all. What we're saying is there's no process in place to identify it today and then apply some kind of management controls to it. Excuse me. Even considering the top 46% of the Databerg diagram here, you'll notice that a very small amount of that, less than half, that 16% number, is actually what's deemed business critical information. So there's still, even in your known content, a fairly high percentage of information that is probably ripe for disposal, or at least ripe for examination for potential disposition. So, given this kind of Databerg scenario, I thought it might be helpful to recap what I hear from some of your peers when they consider the risks associated with this Databerg type information. We call this our data at rest threat matrix. So by far and away, the most common one that we hear is we need to be able to locate and identify sensitive information. What's really interesting to me is that term sensitive information varies so widely from situation to situation. You know, many companies have really great controls in place, for example, credit card data, because they've been or had to be PCI compliant for quite a long amount of time. But those same firms might have a ton of Social Security information that's laying around on the network that they're not even looking for or aware of. Being able to identify that sensitive content in whatever category it falls into and take steps to remediate it appropriately can really help reduce your risk footprint from terms of a potential breach. In industries with a lot of intellectual property, there's often a concern that employees will leak proprietary information, especially if you suspect they're about to leave the organization. One of the strategies that you can use to help kind of remediate this risk is to limit the amount of time employees have access to that information. There may indeed be a legitimate business case that they need to have those documents, have them on their local PC even, but that doesn't mean they have to have them indefinitely. So if you can apply some sort of controls to manage and limit the amount of that content, it can really help in terms of your exposure footprint. Organizations with a lot of remote workers, which, of course, really is right now everybody, in that case, these user hard drives are notoriously hard to control. Unless you lock workstations down completely so that employees perhaps can't save information to them, which really isn't very practical, especially today since so many people are working from home. Or maybe you implement some kind of a VDI type infrastructure so that people aren't storing a lot of files locally, they're just using a session. You really need a way to identify content that's on those local drives and then perhaps put some kind of remediation process in place for that information. Search and destroy, we typically see these kinds of use cases come into play in terms of an email environment. So we often hear our clients have to go out and do some kind of a exercise where they're looking through the mail system for a potential phishing message, virus attachment, and being able to quickly identify that and remove it from their email infrastructure. As you all well know, the longer those potential threat messages stay around, the more likelihood there is somebody's going to click on them and cause some kind of a large problem for you. So this next category, preemptive incident response classification. This is kind of a different approach to the way you're looking at your information, and it has to deal with preemptively categorizing it so you know what category that content falls into. And in terms of categories, I'm talking about things like personal, private, confidential, it contains PII. There could be any number of those depending upon what your records retention schedule looks like. But once you've kind of tagged and identified that content as it being in one of those buckets, it becomes much easier to manage that moving forward. For example, if you have to answer the question, what confidential files were on this laptop that was just stolen? If that's been classified in inventory, then you can answer that question very rapidly and know what your potential risk exposure is. And then finally, between possible litigation and the increase in privacy legislation, things like GDPR and CCPA, it's important to have tools already deployed and in place to help you address an e-discovery search or perhaps respond rapidly to a data subject access request when it comes in. This is something that I think has cooled off a little bit given the immediate situation we had with the pandemic and everybody's scrambled to comply with their remote worker mandate. However, we certainly look for privacy legislation to come back with a vengeance once this sort of settles down. Many states were already considering a CCPA-like regulation that would apply to their state, and ultimately we believe there's probably going to be some sort of a federal mandate to control privacy. So here at Sherpa, we're helping our clients address these risks through 3 software modules that can either work independently or in tandem. One of those is called data governance. So this component of our Altitude solution can be used for a variety of purposes. You see it covers several of those risk categories at the top of the diagram. That could be something as simple as performing a data inventory to help you identify where information is. Or it could be much more extensive. Once that data inventory is developed, how do we apply some sort of retention controls to that content? The second module falls into that preemptive incident response category. We call it, in fact, our classification module. And classification is really about enabling companies to attach tags, develop tags for their document categories, and then attach those to each one of those pieces of information. Those tags might be things like personal, client confidential, contains PII. Those categories can then be used to drive retention throughout the document lifecycle and keep track of those pieces of information. And then finally, there's a tool or a component for e-discovery. So e-discovery empowers your legal teams and your privacy teams to be able to search for content based on keyword terms, phrases, expressions, and other criteria, review those matching results, and then decide which of those results are relevant to their case or perhaps their FOIA information request or their DSAR request. So it's a way to kind of quickly identify and respond to that information. So what we found in the past is often it's instructional to understand how other clients are managing their electronic content in this content-centric approach that I've been kind of talking about. So I've pulled out two particular client examples that I wanted to share with you today. The client that I'm referencing in this first use case is managing their at-risk information for a worldwide consulting services firm. So the project began with a fairly modest goal. They wanted to enforce their records retention policies against specific types of messages that were stored in PST files. What made them unique was that effort involved over 100,000 workstations. And as they scanned those workstations to identify PST content, they were a little horrified to find out that they had over 700,000 PST files resident on those machines. So I guess a couple of things about this use case. First of all, they've been using this for several years now. They're very happy with the way this helps them control those specific types of messages inside PSTs. We hear often that it's difficult to do this at scale with this many employees or this many files, but it certainly is possible. The success of that use case spurred the inside counsel to develop a second use case. They thought about this approach and how it was eliminating potentially litigious information from those PSTs, and they decided to become a little bit more proactive. And in this example, they piloted a case with their audit teams to be able to identify again PST content based on specific criteria in this category age categories, 3 to 7 years and over 7 years. But then they presented a list of that information to these auditors and said, hey, which of these messages in these PST files, or in fact, which PST files in total, do you think we can safely delete? The auditors were then able to select that information and they were able to remediate it. And that was very successful for them. It resulted in about a 50% reduction in the amount of identified content. And in fact, they're planning on rolling that out organization-wide. And then my third use case for this particular client, these tend to propagate within an organization. Their engagement teams, as they finish a project, are going to security and having the security team scan the project team members' devices to see if there's information that remains from that client engagement that needs to be remediated. In the second use case here, it's a very similar kind of a process. This one is a little bit more business process oriented. So they took a 3-stage approach to managing information for their employees. As employees get assigned to a project, they undergo an onboarding process. That process creates designated storage locations in both their mailbox and their local workstation for documents that are going to be developed and shared with clients during the course of the engagement. So the first part of the onboarding creates those repositories, and then it notifies the employee that those repositories are in place and available to use as part of their project. As that project wraps up, then the engagement manager goes back and triggers an offboarding process by notifying their records management team. They scan the project team members' devices then to determine if there's any remaining content in those repositories, the folders in the mailbox, the locations on the local hard drives that were created. If there is, they notify the employees electronically that the content was found. Employees can log into a portal site and mark the items that should be either retained or perhaps disposed of. That self-service capability is being triggered through a single sign-on so that the team members have access to it. And we found it's very effective to be able to have those subject matter experts, the people who are involved with those documents, perhaps even created those documents, deciding the eventual disposition of them, as opposed to somebody who really doesn't know how important that document was. Is it going to be needed again for future engagement? We should archive it, that sort of thing. So just a couple of thoughts about how you might be able to manage information in your environment based on how some other clients are tackling that problem. So that about brings me to the end of my time allocation today. I sincerely thank you for taking time to listen. To learn more about any of the things that I've talked about, you can visit us at sherpasoftware.com, or you can stop by our virtual booth here at the Data Connectors event. My colleague Greg is manning the booth today. He'd be happy to address any questions you have, or maybe get you some additional information. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.